Chapter 9 of Betty Baird by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 9, Her First Reception. A month had passed since the great Latin controversy, and Betty had found school life somewhat more in accord with her old dreams. For with a roommate like Lois, and one of the older girls for a staunch supporter, as Mary Livingstone was when she had time, no girl could be utterly forlorn. However, she missed the excitement of a crowd, to which she had been accustomed in Weston, for one of the greatest charms of boarding school in her anticipations had been the chatter and hubbub and constantly changing scenes of a house full of girls of her own age. She loved people, and always liked to have them near. She could study with a room full of babbling girls, and enter into the conversation without effort, for she could talk and study in the same breath. In this respect, she and Lois were very different, and when Lois had to be alone, it fell to Betty to turn the other girls out of the room. The time for the first reception drew near, and Betty was troubled about her dress. Her deficiencies in matters of clothes had been so mercilessly exposed by Miriam and Caroline that even her unconcern was disturbed. She still wondered why it made so much difference, and seldom noticed what others wore, but she was too sensitive to expose herself unnecessarily to their criticisms. What should she wear? Miss Jane had been very firm and explicit in her direction as to when the lilac silk should be worn, and it was not to be worn for a small occasion like this. Her mother was not strenuous about such details, so Betty accepted Miss Jane, being a dressmaker, as an authority, and an authority that could not lightly be disregarded, but her soul loathed the black silk. Then there was her hair. For a discouraged moment she almost determined not to go down to the reception, but it was only for a moment. No, she could not miss that. Nothing could make her miss her first reception at boarding school. Perhaps Cousin Elizabeth would remember to arrange it, as she once said she would. With her hair smooth and stylish like theirs, perhaps with a pompadour, she might pass the girls without much criticism. She did not express these thoughts aloud, even to Lois, because she could not bear to be pitied, but she knew that all the girls regarded the arrangement of one's hair as the criterion of smartness. The reception evening came. Fortunately, as Betty thought, Miss Payne remembered her promise to arrange her hair, but the vexed question of the dress was still unsettled. "What shall I wear?" she cried to Lois. "Why not wear that pretty violet check?" answered Lois. "But that is my Thanksgiving reception dress. I must save it for that. Miss Jane said." "Miss Jane? Who is Miss Jane?" inquired Lois. "Miss Jane! It seems so strange you don't know her. Why, she sews for us, and she is the dearest, crankiest old body in the world. Knits wash rags — here is one — when she can't do anything else, and gives them away. She made all my duds. I'd like to see her, but you must settle about your dress. Do wear the violet," insisted Lois. "Well, mother likes me to use my own judgment in such matters, and Miss Jane will never know," added Betty, brightening, for she longed to get into that lovely brand new dress, and taking it down from the hook, she threw it on the bed, saying, "Now I must be off to Cousin Elizabeth and be made beautiful. I'll put the dress on when I come back." At the last word she flew out of the room. She returned in half an hour, looking wholly unlike herself. In a praiseworthy effort to curb the wild, wiry mop, Miss Payne had dampened it until it was several shades darker than normal, and, after much patient manipulation, had fashioned little corkscrew curls all over the pretty head. It was a strange thing, perhaps, for Miss Payne to do, but the truth was that while her feeling for good form in general was strong, she gave little thought to such details as passing styles of hair dressing. Her attention was attracted only by something much out of the ordinary. Such, in truth, was Betty's tangled mop of short hair, the only short hair in the school, and the sole alternative seemed to be to make it sleek. "Oh," breathed Lois when she saw it. "What on earth has she done to you?" "Made me beautiful, of course," answered Betty, as she stepped gingerly to the mirror, afraid of disturbing the elaborate coiffure. "Murder!" she screamed, catching sight of her wondrous head and sinking on the floor in a gale of mirth. She sat there rocking back and forth, her arms clasped tight, and emitting peal after peal of laughter at the fantastic image facing her in the mirror. Lois was desperate. She knotted and unknotted her handkerchief. She implored Betty to get up. She started to fan her hair. She dropped the fan and ran for a towel. She threw away the towel. At last she sank into the rocking chair with her arms dangling helplessly at her side. "Oh, I could cry!" she exclaimed. "It is almost time to go down. I could shake you for laughing. Your cousin must be crazy. Do get up. I'll mop it with this towel and fan it. We must get ready. We have only 10 minutes." Betty's only response was one of her provoking quotations, delivered with grave gesture to the image in the glass. "O cobra curled, fierce fanged fair one, draw night's curtain o'er the landscape of thy hair. I yield, I kneel, I own, I bless thy law that dooms me to despair." Lois jumped out of the chair. "Oh, get up! You'll drive me crazy. What in the world are we going to do?" "Why, I am going just as I am, of course," she replied, getting up nimbly. "But you can't go looking that way." "I can and I am. Don't you think I hate it?" she said, almost breaking down and biting her lips to keep back the tears. "But there is nothing else to do," and she added more calmly, "Now I'll slip on my dress and we'll go." "Oh, Betty, you can't go that way. You'll be the laughing stock of the place." "Cousin Elizabeth didn't laugh." "I should think she would have known better than to fix your hair that way." "Perhaps she did it to keep down my pride," said Betty, her eyes twinkling and smiles again chasing one another over her face. "But do hurry, Betty. You must let me fan it." "No, I am going this way." "Oh, you contrary girl," wailed Lois. "Why do you persist in anything so foolish?" "It is this way, Lois. I care a good deal more for Cousin Elizabeth's feelings than I do for those girls who haven't spared mine. And she was really pleased over my hair. Yes, you may look amazed, but she was, and she'll notice if I change it. You see, Lois, she didn't want me to look so wild, and she usually pays no attention to such little things anyhow. Miss Greene is the one who does. Besides, I am kind of daring myself to do it." "There! I suspected pride was at the bottom of it," said Lois severely. "You are the proudest girl I ever saw. You hate to think you are afraid to go down there and have those girls laugh at you." "Come, let us go down, unless you are ashamed to walk with me." "I never desert my friends, even when they go crazy," answered Lois, nettled at Betty's perverseness. When they came to the door of the reception room, Lois discovered that she had left her handkerchief behind, and saying that she would be back in a minute or two, ran upstairs, leaving Betty alone at the door. She looked into the brilliantly lighted room, and her heart seemed to stop beating at the thought of walking its length to where Miss Payne stood. The company, though not large, included many distinguished people, for Miss Payne loved lions and knew how to cage them in her drawing room, and tonight she was unusually fortunate in having a distinguished portrait painter, several singers who were favorites with the metropolitan public, a writer of distinction, a famous Asiatic traveler, an Italian countess, and a number of prominent club women, as well as all the fashionable mothers who lived near. The room was not yet filled, and the entrance of even a young girl could not, in those first moments of social adjustment, pass unnoticed. This Betty realized only too keenly as she waited for Lois. "I can't go in," she said to herself in a whisper, clasping her cold little fingers together behind her, her white face quivering with dread as she saw the laughing, handsomely gowned figures flitting gracefully and carelessly by. "I must go, and I'll go in before Lois comes, for if I am ashamed of my own appearance, I ought not to ask her to bear it with me, after refusing her advice, too," and biting her underlip until it was crimson, she walked into the room. Her appearance was greeted with smiles, giggles, and suppressed laughter by a group of girls near the door. "Just look at Paderewski, won't you?" exclaimed Miriam. "Well, if she isn't the craziest," answered Jess, laughing and staring. Helen smiled derisively and glanced at Dorothy to see if she was laughing. Betty flushed, but she walked by them with no other sign that she heard. "She's too much for me," said Jess. "I know she's no one's fool after the way she read Virgil and keeps up in all her lessons. But to come here with corkscrew curls, like those in Godey's Ladies' Book of 1860, beats my time." "Oh, hush, Jess. Someone will hear you use slang and think us ill-bred," said Helen reprovingly. "Oh, I heard Dorothy use that only yesterday, and I thought it must be the proper caper," answered Jess with a tantalizing smile, for Dorothy was Helen's model. "Oh, look at the little darling!" exclaimed Mrs. Terry, the well-known soprano, to one of the club celebrities. "She is the quaintest picture I have seen for a long time," and she smiled on Betty, who could hardly believe that the smile was meant for her, but who instinctively smiled back and felt much better for the amenities. The color came to her cheeks, and as her hair had almost dried in the warm room, she began to appear more natural. Miss Payne greeted her with an approving nod, and Betty, knowing that her hair had not escaped the all-embracing glance she gave her, was cheered to know that it had not been a futile martyrdom. But seeing Lois seized by the Miriam set, a sense of loneliness crept over her, and she felt angry that she could not be like other girls, and stand in the happy groups and watch the people and talk and laugh. As she stood there, the famous painter saw her and asked Miss Payne to introduce him to that little bunch of lilacs. "Why, that is my little cousin and namesake," she answered, highly delighted, and she sent for Betty by one of the girls, who rather ungraciously delivered her message. Betty hurried over to them, and though embarrassed at the thought of speaking to the great man, for the girls had talked more about him than about any one else, his kind, gracious manner soon put her at her ease, and without knowing it, she told the story of the lilac dress. Under the influence of those friendly, interested eyes that nothing escaped, she talked as simply and naturally as if conversing with Lois. A year later, a picture called The Lilac Gown was the chef d'oeuvre of the salon, and the fresh, girlish face looking out from it was wonderfully like Betty's. "Who is that young girl over there with the face of a miniature?" asked Mrs. Livingstone of her daughter. "I wore my hair that way when I was her age, and what a quaint dress!" "Oh, that is the brightest girl in the school, and the funniest," she answered as she went for Betty. "Oh, see Mary Livingstone's mother talking to that fright. I am surprised that Mary took her up to her, for Mrs. Livingstone is so particular," whispered Miriam to Helen Dyke. "Have you met Mrs. Livingstone?" inquired Helen. "No, have you?" "No," said Helen regretfully. "Why, every girl in the room laughed when that guy came in," continued Miriam. "Aren't those curls hideous?" asked Jessie. "Perfectly awful," they responded. Several other girls joined the group, and the conversation waxed warm over Betty's hair and dress. "I should be ashamed to speak to her," lisped one of them. "Why, look," said Helen, "every one is making a fuss over her." "She fixed herself that way to be conspicuous," said the sharp-tongued Miriam. "She is certainly deep," said Helen, with a determination to make friends with Betty as soon as possible. Mrs. Livingstone and Mrs. King were evidently making much of her, and laughing as if she were saying bright things. More than one girl at the Pines that night saw something more in Betty than a poor, uninteresting country girl. So Miss Jane's old-fashioned and countrified dressmaking and Miss Payne's surprising ignorance of a modern girl's hairdressing turned to Betty's favor. After the guests had gone, Miss Payne spoke a few words to Betty about the reception. "Mrs. Livingstone and Mrs. King said some very pleasant things about my namesake. I am glad I arranged your hair so becomingly," she added, stepping off and admiring the effect of the tight little curls that even yet had hardly opened, so firmly had they been glued together. "Your mother has trained you beautifully. If I had any criticism, it would be that you are apt to become excited and talk too much." Betty told Lois that her cousin had made her feel that she had been a regular firecracker, each curl going off, fizz, sputter, bang, and added, "I wish I were like you, Lois. Everything you said tonight was so sweet and appropriate." "Oh, how can you be so silly? You were the most admired girl there, the belle. No one could hold a candle to you, corkscrews and all." The reception was the turning point of the roommates' life at the school. Mary Livingstone, although older than Betty and with special friends in her own class, found her extremely interesting, the more so as they both delighted in poetry, particularly in the ballads, and vied with each other in finding new ones and committing them to memory. Jessie Bentworth told Betty in her blunt manner that it was a shame the way they had treated her, and that her own feelings had changed towards her when she found she really wasn't a boaster. She had too much delicacy to mention the unfavorable impression the country clothes had made on them, but Lois knew the cause of their prejudice, and it took her longer to feel friendly towards them than it did Betty, who found it so nice to have a friendly crowd around her that she was willing to accept their motives at their own valuation. Following the reception, everything was bright for Betty until the beginning of the following week, when she made a new enemy, and one who, for a time, materially retarded her progress in one study. Miss Leet, the teacher of mathematics, was always more or less sarcastic to those who were not thoroughly prepared for the recitation, except to Miriam, who received marked evidences of her favoritism. Betty was weak in mathematics. Study as hard as she could, she seemed to make no progress, and algebra, being Miriam's favorite study, the only one in fact in which she was not dull, she gloried in showing her superiority over Betty. It was patent to all the girls that Miss Leet took advantage of every opportunity to enable her to do this, with the not unnatural result that Betty conceived a hearty dislike for the teacher. In the algebra class, on the Monday following the reception, Miss Leet, probably actuated by Betty's triumph at the reception, showed more than ever her favoritism for Miriam and her dislike for Betty, and subjected the latter to a series of comments which exhausted her stock of sarcasm. Betty's new friends, with the well-known enthusiasm of converts, were highly indignant, and as soon as the recitation was finished, repaired to her room under Lois's leadership to hold an indignation meeting. Betty, detained downstairs for some minutes, was thoughtfully mounting the stairs when she saw Miss Leet, her head bent close to the door, listening so intently to the voices of the girls within that she had not heard Betty, who, dumbfounded, stood stock still for a moment, staring at her, then brushed unceremoniously past and walked into the room, closing the door with a slam. Miss Leet knocked at once, but not before Betty had time to say, "Eavesdropper, do as I do," and instantly a tableau was formed. As Miss Leet walked in, she saw 10 girls as silent as statues, standing with their heads bent as if listening, each right hand forming an ear trumpet. Without a word she turned and left the room. The girls straightened up with deep indrawn breaths and looked at each other. "Well, of all the mean, low, sneaking, contemptible things I ever heard of, that is the worst," burst out Betty, her face aflame, her eyes wide with indignation, her whole frame quivering with rage. "Oh," laughed Jess, "we have known for a good while that she was doing that, but this is the first time she has been caught." But it's outrageous!" exclaimed Betty. "I never would have believed a teacher could do such a thing." "Oh, she is in a class all by herself," said Jess, and the interrupted indignation meeting proceeded with added vigor. The numerous petty persecutions, by which Miss Leech showed to whom she attributed her severe lesson in honor, only drew the girls closer to Betty. They felt that she was persecuted for their sake, as they all had long tried to devise some plan by which Miss Leet could be apprised that her habit of listening was known to them. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 10 of Betty Baird by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 10, Halloween. "Are you aware, young people, what evening this is?" asked Betty of the girls, who, as their custom was, had dropped into her room while waiting for the dinner hour. There were no dull moments where Betty was. "What evening? The 31st of October? Oh, Halloween, to be sure," cried Dorothy. "Let's celebrate. How can we do it, Betty?" asked Lois. "Allow me to think," answered Betty, grandly. "Please don't. It's dangerous." "Then it isn't allowed here in school," said Jess. "Well, if that is a rule, it is one you never break," retorted Betty. "You're right there, Betty," affirmed Caroline. "Jess had that rule passed so she could graduate sometime. It was her only chance." Jess's only reply was a playful dig. "Hurrah! I have an idea," cried Helen. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Does it hurt you, dear?" asked Jess in a ludicrously sympathetic tone. "Terribly," responded Helen. "But what is it?" they all demanded. "It is this," answered Helen impressively. "Let those of us who are in Miss Leet's algebra class form a society of never thinks and elect Betty president." "Good, good!" they cried in chorus. "Allow me to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this unexpected honor," said Betty majestically, bowing profoundly to right and left. "But to our celebration this evening. We must do something." "The best Halloween stunt I ever heard of," said Jess, "is that if you go backwards into a dark room alone at midnight with a candle in one hand and a mirror in the other, your future husband will look over your shoulder at you in the mirror." "Oh, that's jolly!" cried Dorothy. "I'm in for that." "Well, I can't say I'm much in favor of husbands," said Mary, who had just come in, "but for the joke of it, I'll do it." "Who wants to see a husband?" scorned Betty. "But it would be nice and spooky." "I know I am cut out for an old maid," said Lois, "so I'll not see any future husband." "Miss Leet will be after us if we do it," said the cautious Caroline. "Well, let her," snapped Betty. Midnight came, the midnight of Halloween. The brown earth showing through the thin covering of the fleecy flakes of an early snow was hard and forbidding. The wind moaned and shrieked around the corners of the house, while the giant pines clashed their mighty arms together. It was one of nature's few repellent moods. It was indeed the night and the hour for supernatural influences. Mystery was in the air. The great trees with their eager ghostly branches had locked within them the haunting memories of the nights when elves and fairies and gnomes, their long abode opened by magic power on this one night of the year, had come forth from the solemn and majestic mountains to disport themselves at midnight in the forest and on the green by the light of the pale winter moon, as for one short hour they held in elfin power this somber, tired old earth. "Shh!" hush was all that could be heard as 8 white-robed figures glided through the dimly lighted corridors to meet in Betty's room, their white kimonos and their unbraided hair giving an elfish, witchish appearance, as if they were indeed stealing forth from some cranny to meet a phantom bridegroom. Betty had made a garland of artificial flowers, blue forget-me-nots, and entwined them in her hair in mad Ophelia style, and every girl had some characteristic touch in honor of the occasion. "It's a lang and mirk night," whispered Betty, as they waited for the town clock to strike the midnight hour, for as she said, and she was the authority on such matters, no influence can come from fairyland before the clock strikes 12. That is their hour. I think I can see their fairy court now, riding through the forest over there," she continued, as they stood huddled together at the great window overlooking the park and the mountains beyond the silent, frozen river. The village clock struck the hour. Breathlessly they counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It stopped. "Who'll go first?" was the whispered question. "I won't," said Dorothy. "I'm afraid of that big empty classroom." "I'll go," volunteered Betty. She stood looking out of the window as if watching for her elfin knight, and then, without a word, took up the silver candlestick, the flame flickering uneasily in the slight breeze as she moved. In her other hand she held the mirror. They watched her in scared silence as she entered the empty room and closed the door after her. 5 long, shivery, scary minutes passed. Then she came out, grave and quiet. "What did you see? What did you see?" whispered the girls excitedly. "You remember we vowed not to tell until all had been in," Betty solemnly reminded them. "Did you really see anything?" Mary asked her, but Betty replied only with the word, "Go," and Mary took the mirror and candle and went in. She returned presently, shivering and white. The other girls looked apprehensive, and 1 or 2 suggested that they go back to their rooms. "No, I am going in now," said Lois bravely, though her voice was tremulous. "Don't go, Lois," said Betty, thinking she was frightened. "You know this isn't a dare." "I'm not one of those 'fraid cats," answered Lois, and she went into the dark, empty room. She soon came out laughing, with her finger on her lips. "I heard Miss Leet say to someone down at the foot of the stairs that she thought she heard rats in the classroom, so I hurried back." The girls hardly breathed as they heard a faint, slippered tread in the hall. The candle was extinguished, and the winter moon, looking in at the casement, saw huddled there 8 pretty scared faces, with a very commonplace influence superseding the supernatural one. But with Betty the power of the old romances still held sway. Her sympathetic imagination had carried her too far into Elfland to be frightened away by any fear of discovery. She stood by the window and felt more akin to the fairies than to her companions. She would have to wait a whole year for the strange little people to come again. She was brought back to earth by a tap on the shoulder as Mary whispered, "Good night, Ophelia. My respects to your wee man." The next afternoon the 3 girls who had tempted fate were besieged by the others of the Halloween party to tell whether they had seen anything in the mirror. They were all together in Betty's room. Jess dropped on the floor, Helen perched on the foot of the bed, while Dorothy, Caroline, and Belle Hunter sat on the long, wide window sill. "Say, Mary, that wasn't a bad bluff of yours last night," announced Jess. "Bluff? What makes you think it was a bluff?" demanded Mary. "Why, everybody knows such things don't happen nowadays," Caroline answered in a know-it-all tone. "Well, if everybody knows that, why were you afraid to go in last night?" Betty asked crushingly. "Honestly now, did you see anything?" Jess persisted. Betty and Mary looked at each other and shook their heads solemnly. "You promised to tell," urged Dorothy. "Oh, no, we didn't. We promised not to tell until all had been in," answered Betty. "That's true," said Mary, "and you'll only have to wait another year to try for yourselves," she added coolly. "You mean things! Why won't you tell?" complained Caroline. Mary and Betty whispered mysteriously together. "My advice to you girls is to stay in your rooms next Halloween night," Mary said gravely. "You won't be any happier if you go," was Betty's sibylline warning, and she looked unutterable things. "As long as I live, I'll remember last night," said Mary. "Well, you are a nice pair," said Jess, as she flounced out, followed by the others. Had they followed Miss Leet's example and listened at the door, they could have heard suppressed giggles as Mary turned to Betty. "I didn't see a thing, did you?" she asked. "Mercy, no!" exclaimed Betty, laughing. "What made you so white, Mary?" Lois asked. Mary laughed heartily. "Well, to tell the truth, a mouse about as big as the end of my thumb scampered across the floor, and I left in a hurry, but I wouldn't let one of those girls know it for the world." "I was scared away by that rat Leedy," laughed Lois. "Oh, by the way, that reminds me, there is more trouble brewing for poor old Leedy. I received a note from John this morning. He's my youngest brother, you know, and he says some of the boys from his school are coming over to serenade us this evening. We haven't had a serenade this year." "Oh, good! It will be my first serenade. It will be so romantic!" exclaimed Betty rapturously, a sentiment with which Lois fully agreed. The two wings of the building containing the dormitories enclosed a long, narrow court. In the summer, a beautiful fountain, tall bay trees, several marble benches, and the vine-covered walls made it a very attractive retreat, but on this night it presented a deserted appearance, for the fountain was silent, the bays had found a winter refuge in the great hall, and the marble seats and terrace were covered with a light snow. It was, though, an ideal night for music. Moonlit, the air cold, clear, and sparkling. So thought the 12 young students from the Kipp Preparatory School as they stood in the court and began the prelude to that old favorite, the Spanish Cavalier. The mandolins, banjos, and guitars gave forth ravishing sounds in the still frosty night. Candlelight soon gleamed from 20 windows, and subdued clappings of hands and suppressed laughter floated down to the young troubadours. Betty and Lois thrilled with the sweet strains. They were fair ladies of old in their castle strong. Brave knights were at their casement. The drawbridge was down. No enemy was in sight. The next song gave all the girls an extra thrill. "Here's to the good old pines, drink it down. Here's to the good old pines, drink it down. Here's to the good old pines, all her girls have Gibson lines. Drink it down, drink it down, drink it down, down, down. Balm of Gilead, Gilead, balm of Gilead, Gilead. We won't go home any more, we won't go home any more, we won't go home any more," etc. In the midst of the affirmations of that oft-repeated last line, they were rudely awakened from their romantic dreams by the appearance, at the entrance to the court, of 2 tall black-robed female figures, which, with much wavings of arms, actually shooed the youthful minstrels. "Shoo! Shoo! Go away! Get out! Shoo!" insisted Miss Leet's high, shrill voice. The opening to the court was narrow, and those 2 tall figures with long outstretched arms effectually barred it to the now panic-stricken knights. Giggles from numerous windows pursued them. Many suggestions were hurled at them. "Buck center," came the voice of one, a football enthusiast. "Jump over," called another. "Borrow an airship," advised a third. Back and forth they ran, one brave knight fearlessly climbing upon the window sill, but as it led him nowhere he dropped back. At last, duck under was advised by some level head, and there being no other way, duck under they did, and scurried across the lawn, followed by a gale of laughter. In vain the grim figures held up warning arms. The sight was too ridiculous, and "Good night, kind sirs," broke simultaneously from all the windows. Betty and Lois ceased to giggle only when sleep overcame them. End of chapter 10. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 11 of Betty Baird by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 11. The Play. School life went on in quiet grooves, Betty conscientiously holding herself to her studies, which indeed she would be unlikely to neglect, for she realized, as forcibly as a young girl could, her great privilege in being enabled to attend such a school, and this, combined with her ambition to please her parents, led her to study faithfully. She was first in her class in every branch except mathematics, where Miss Leet's continual enmity made it almost impossible for her to overcome her natural distaste for the subject, as she might easily have done with a teacher more friendly and interested. But, though studying hard, Betty looked forward with delight to those regular social events, which, while their sole end seemed to be recreation, were in reality very important parts in the student's training in social manners and usages. The next event on the school calendar was the great play at Christmas, for this year the Thanksgiving reception was to be omitted. Betty's relations with the other girls became daily more intimate and friendly. She was the acknowledged leader of her class in every form of fun, both because of her power of leadership and because of the ingenuousness which endeared her to everyone. The girls always knew just where to find her, Jess said. With the Christmas festivities in prospect, Betty had some secret quavers over her clothes. While she knew there was little or no danger of a repetition of the extremely disagreeable experiences she had passed through, she was none the less anxious to appear well in the eyes of her exceedingly modish companions, and the prospect of having the contrast brought out again on a public occasion was very disquieting. Her feelings, however, were much soothed by Miss Payne's kind offer to put her violet silk into the hands of her own New York dressmaker. When it was returned, it was a new garment. "How did she do it?" cried the delighted and amazed girl. "Oh, Roberts is half French," replied Miss Payne laughingly. Betty spent a silent moment in wondering what Miss Jane would say if she called her Hufnagel, and she almost laughed aloud at the fancy. After heartily thanking her cousin, she took her dress to her room. "Now it is a beauty. It will make your dear friend Miriam open her eyes," said the pleased Lois. The few weeks between Thanksgiving and the Christmas holidays were busy ones for the whole school, and the girls almost forgot to mark off the days from the calendar. The Christmas entertainment was always the largest and the most important one of the year. This time a play was to be given in which Betty was assigned a prominent part, one that Miss Payne decided should be taken only by a girl in short skirts. It was the part of the New Woman. Betty planned a fetching and original costume consisting of a short black skirt, a mannish coat with a stiff-bosomed shirt, smart linen collar, and natty bow tie. These, with a low derby hat on her short fair hair, gave a peculiarly piquant and boyish effect. Tan riding boots with leather leggins and a little riding whip completed the New Woman of the play. The rehearsals were always held in one of the wings of the building, the girls dressing in their rooms, then going through a small back hall and down into the auditorium. After dressing for the last rehearsal, Betty decided, without any particular reason, not to go the usual route, but to go through the long drawing room, which at that hour was never occupied. It was simply a caprice, a mood which required something new. Just before entering the room, she twisted a little piece of paper she found in her book into an imitation cigarette. With this held daintily between the fingers of her left hand and the natty whip in her right, and feeling like a lad of 14, Betty walked jauntily into the room and halfway across the floor before she saw two gentlemen sitting on the sofa in the shadow. She felt her cheeks burn. She could not turn back, and her feet almost failed to carry her forward. She glanced at the figures again, and to her horror found that one was the bishop and the other the dignified rector of their church. Worse and worse. Suddenly the thought came to her, maybe they'll think I'm a boy for sure. So she doffed her hat with a right gallant boyish swing. The churchmen responded gravely, and Betty tripped on with a light heart, believing the country was saved. As soon as the rehearsal was over, she rushed to her room to tell Lois, and throwing herself into the rocking chair, she rocked as if her life depended on it. "Oh, Lois, I had the greatest adventure just before rehearsal. Oh, dear, I don't know whether to laugh or cry, but it was so funny. I wonder if they could have suspected." Lois, who was curled up on the window seat, looked up in surprise. "Who could have suspected what? What's wrong with you, Bet? What in the world has happened? An adventure? Oh, go on and tell me, you mean thing. What was it?" Alternately shivering with fear lest she had been discovered, and shrieking with laughter as she felt that maybe she had deceived them into thinking she was a boy, Betty told her story. "You fooled them! You fooled them!" cried Lois. "I know you did. Oh, I wish I had been there. What fun! Good boy, good boy!" And she literally danced in her excitement, which so infected Betty that she jumped up and grasped her hands, and in a moment the two were in a mad whirl around the room, which exhaustion alone stopped. Then they sat down and laughed until they cried. At dinner time, Miss Greene asked Betty to come to her room before the study hour, a not unusual request, for the two had become fast friends. Joyfully she ran up to the quiet room. She found Miss Greene grave on the surface, but the twinkle in her eyes evidently indicated an undercurrent of fun. "What is it, Miss Greene?" asked Betty. "This afternoon, Elizabeth, I had 2 distinguished callers," she began gravely, but could not finish, for the girl dropped to the floor a limp mass. "Now I'll do just what I wanted to do then. Sink through the floor." Try as she might to repress a laugh, Miss Greene had to give way. "You incorrigible child, get up and listen to me." "Not before you absolve me," cried Betty dramatically, but getting up nevertheless. "When I went into the drawing room I caught my serious, dignified guests laughing like schoolboys, though they tried to stop as soon as I appeared. I have known the bishop since I was a child, and he loves to tease me, especially about what he calls my teacherly primness, for I have not always been such a dragon as I am now. Well, I asked what the fun was about, and it pleased the bishop to be very mysterious. "I did not know you had adopted a peculiar garb for your strong-minded young students in this stronghold of intellectuality," he remarked in a tone of grave surprise, as if he had never laughed in his life. Those penetrating eyes of his never left my face, but the hilarity that seemed to emanate from our sober Mr. Carson proved that the bishop had not been suddenly bereft of his reason. And then there were the chuckles that had fallen on my ears as I came in. "What do you mean, Bishop?" I implored, wholly puzzled. "Oh, excuse my then it's not this bewitching costume?" My mystified expression evidently delighted his wicked old heart. "Just before you came in, a young lady passed us dressed in the style, I should think, of the New Woman, a riding whip, and what seemed a cigarette in her hand." "Oh, Miss Greene, not a real one?" "They knew that, dear," she replied, seeing the genuine distress on the girl's face. "They complimented you on your gallantry, and when I told them you were only 14, they understood that it was only a thoughtless prank, and said they were coming to see you play tomorrow night." "Oh, the cuss is come upon me," cried the Lady of Shalott, Betty moaned. "You deserve a scolding for going through the parlors, but I shall say only this. Don't tell anyone about it." "Oh, I had to tell Lois, Miss Greene." "Very well, but make Lois promise not to tell." "Oh, she would never breathe it. She's just the truest girl." "By the way," continued Miss Greene, "the Bishop will bring his 2 grandsons to the play, and I want you to talk with them. They are good boys and great favorites of mine." "If they are half as nice as their grandfather, I'll talk to them all right," replied Betty, glibly, her mind resting on the familiar, kindly old face. "Et tu, Brute?" sighed Miss Greene, reproachfully. Betty understood, and though she colored, she answered stoutly, "A girl doesn't like to be singular in every respect, Miss Greene." "That is true," answered Miss Greene, a little sadly. She realized that Betty had borne much because of her old-fashioned dresses, and that her fine, quaint language had undoubtedly seemed to the girls a part of her singularity. "You look like a fairy," said Betty rapturously, as Lois stood off for inspection after she had dressed for the entertainment. "That is certainly the most elegant, the most recherché, the most stunning dress that ever beautified the Pines." "Is that all?" asked Lois, with affected patience, as Betty stopped for breath, then, as if oblivious to any interruption, proceeded, "You will certainly be the glass of fashion and the mold of form, the observed of all observers," and Betty backed up her quotation by twirling Lois around to get the best possible view of the creation. "You'll do," was her peroration. "It is a good little dress," said the preoccupied Lois, "but what's a dress if one's going to act like a dunce? I know I shall forget my recitation tonight." "You simply can't forget it," answered Betty, emphatically. "I asked you suddenly last night to recite during all the noise the girls were making, to see if you would be upset, and you did it perfectly." "That was a good test," said Lois, brightening. "But then this will be different. Think of all the strangers who will be there. Oh, my! I am selfish to worry over my little part," she added, "when you have so much. All those words in the play, and the acting too, but you always come out ahead." "Well, if my tongue proves as unruly as my heart is just now, it's up in my throat, a very inconvenient place for it. I'll be packed off double quick to a school for stutterers." Lois looked surprised. "Why, you are not frightened, are you?" "I'm clammy with fear." And though Betty laughed, Lois knew she was doing her best to keep her courage up to the sticking point. "You'll come up and help me to change my dress after the play, won't you? For my fingers will be all thumbs, as Miss Jane says." "Indeed I shall. I am anxious to have the girls see you in that dress as it is now. It is lovely and so becoming. I am glad it is fixed. Cousin Elizabeth was so pleased when I told her how ravishing it is. If she weren't so busy, I think she would be nearly as funny and good to us as Miss Greene. But," and Betty shook her head, "next to the mother, there is no one like Miss Greene for understanding." Lois had finished dressing and was sitting on the window seat, alternately groaning and reciting her poem. Betty rambled on while she put the finishing touches to the new woman's suit. "I wonder whether the Bishop will know me when I am changed into a little girl. I wonder what his grandsons will be like. Oh, hateful as all boys are, teasing and rude. However, Miss Greene says these are particularly fine, and maybe there is some hope for them." "I don't know many boys," answered Lois, thoughtfully. "Those I do seem very nice and quiet." "You ought to meet some of the Weston boys," exclaimed Betty, hotly. "They send you comic valentines and mimic you. Edith and I just pass them by with scorn, our noses up in the air. But," she went on enthusiastically, "if these boys are like Bishop Waborne, they'll be splendid. Am I all right?" She was dressed in her new woman's suit with a yellow rose in her buttonhole. She looked extremely pretty and interesting. "Well, you're a wonder. You can wear anything," said Lois. "Oh," she continued with a groan, "if my recitation were only over I would be happy." "'Tis never too late for delight, my dear," quoted Betty. Mary Livingstone had been assigned the leading part in the play. To this her age and standing in the school entitled her. The other parts were distributed among the better known girls of the different classes. Of these, Betty had one of the most prominent, and the fact that a new girl had been selected for it caused a good deal of envy and excited comment among the less fortunate. "Why should Bet Baird be in the play?" asked Caroline of Miriam. "Oh, she's Miss Green's pet, as everyone can see," answered that sweet-natured girl. "Someone said she is related to Miss Payne," said a girl standing by. "Never in the world! That country girl?" protested Miriam. "Well, that country girl, as you call her, Miriam, is growing mighty popular, and she certainly comes within an ace of being the cleverest girl in the school. Even Leetey had to own up that she was pretty when I asked her," said Jessie in her teasing way. "Jess Bentworth, I am surprised at you. Did you have the impudence to ask Miss Leet such a question when you know how trying that country girl is to her?" "That country girl," again quoted Jess maliciously, "wouldn't be so trying in algebra if Leetey were fair." "I didn't know that you too had become a victim of that designing snip," retorted Miriam. "Oh, I haven't become a victim, but I do like a girl who can read Virgil as well as she can." At this there was a cold-hearted giggle at Miriam's expense. "Dogs delight to bark and bite, for 'tis their nature to," said Mary Livingstone as she passed the angry Miriam and the cool, tormenting Jess. "Wait, Mary, I'll go with you," cried the exasperated Miriam, glad to get out of the clutches of the greatest tease in the school. As Miriam walked off with Mary, she saw Betty coming towards them, arm in arm with Dorothy. "You can't budge an inch without seeing that hateful thing," muttered Miriam. "Now, Miriam," said the philosophical Mary, "you can't keep down a splendid girl like Betty," and turning directly towards her, she added emphatically, "you only make yourself disliked by trying." The play was a success. Betty astonished everyone by her spirited interpretation, for while her lines were no more important than several others, so vivid was her presentation that in the eyes of the audience she assumed a place fully equal to Mary's. This was due largely to her old childish habit of make-believe, which she had kept much longer than the majority of girls. Before the hour set for beginning she had gone off alone for a while and imagined herself into the part. The Bishop was carried away by her spirited acting, and applauded as vigorously as his young grandson Reginald, with whom he fully agreed that she was great. He had a humorous recollection of the blushing young face of the day before, and it gave him the interest one feels in an acquaintance. Betty caught a glance from his keen eyes, shining young and blue out of the florid, weather-beaten, white-crowned face. His eagle nose and thin compressed lips showed the man of iron will. He possessed in a marked degree that look of authority which comes after many years of executive power, but over his stern features radiated a smile so bright and glancing, so kind, that Betty, in speaking of it to Miss Green, likened it to the waters of a spring rippling over a rock. The latent fire of hero worship was kindled, and Betty found in the Bishop a hero. When she had changed back into the little girl of 14, a little bunch of lilacs, Miss Green took the roommates up to him, and the Bishop thought he had never seen a dearer little face than the one looking up so shyly into his. Betty had, in 3½ months, discovered that it was not necessary for her to make conversation, something she had had much trouble to learn. She now had a great desire to say something witty to her hero, but as nothing came to her, she did not give herself any anxiety about being entertaining, as she would have done formerly. Miss Green had seen this haste to make conversation, the outgrowth of her leadership and a detestation of things poky, and had impressed upon her a quotation from her favorite novelist, one too deep and difficult for Betty to read, but the wisdom of the quotation was not obscure, even to a girl of 14. "Preserve your composure until you have something to say. Wait for your opening. It will come, and the right word with it. The main things are to be able to stand well, walk well, and look with an eye at home in its socket." Knowing Betty's temptation and excitement to pump up her wit, Miss Green enlarged on it, and applied it with friendly remorselessness. While Betty's ready wit and originality, combined with more sterling qualities, had won the schoolgirls, to the tired, world-worn bishop her pretty quiet way of looking up at him had more attraction than repartee. The bishop enjoyed a good joke, though it was said that his own were only passable, and tonight, with his young grandsons, lads of 15 and 17, he was the youngest of the group. "You children talk here while I speak to Miss Payne and the other folks I know. When I come back I'll tell you a first-class story. Come, Miss Greene. Paul here is studying for the priesthood. He'll be chaperone. Besides, the new woman doesn't need one." As he said this, the bishop placed his white, firm Episcopal hand on the shoulder of a tall, slender, handsome youth, with a pale face lighted up by the spirit of an enthusiast, then moved off in his joyous, stately fashion. "He always says that," grumbled Paul. "He? Who's he?" asked Betty pertly. She thought he should speak more respectfully of his splendid old grandfather. The boy turned away proudly, vexed and hurt. It is hard to tell when boys are hurt, they hide it so carefully. Betty decided that he was a sulky fellow, and as such he was especially displeasing to her. Better have them rude and teasing if one must have them, she thought as she started away. She had gone only a step or two when Paul called to her, half commanding, half pleading. "Please excuse me." "Oh, certainly," she said casually. Then, glancing at the big boy and seeing something that made her sorry for him, her kind little heart relented, and she came near him again and began asking him all sorts of questions rather teasingly. Wouldn't he please tell her about his work? Was he going to be a priest? Was he high church? Ought she call him father? She hurled these questions at the lad until he didn't know what to do. He tried to be tactful, but blundered terribly. "I am only a student," he said at last, "and I think you would find a description of our work much more interesting than church history." "Oh, I love church history. I was reared on it," exclaimed Betty. "But this is no place for a serious discussion," replied the desperate youth. "But ought you lose an opportunity for enlightening me?" At this he looked decidedly grumpy, which did not surprise her, for to her all boys were alike unamiable. "Perhaps you don't approve of acting," she suggested primly. "I enjoy Shakespeare when he is faithfully portrayed," Paul replied in a cold, impersonal voice. "Oh, I have never seen him portrayed," she answered exasperatingly, for she thought him affected. "The play tonight," she continued, "must have been painful to one like you." This ambiguous remark made the serious youth glance at her to read its meaning. "Did you find your part congenial? Do you like a mannish woman?" he asked abruptly. "But I am only a little girl," she answered, laughing. "At least they won't let me have long skirts, though I beg hard." Looking into the ascetic's eyes, she saw there much seriousness but little humor. He would not be diverted. "I'm not much older than you, and I would not condescend to take a womanish part." "Oh, I should hope not," cried Betty, concealing her desire to laugh at the idea of this stately youth in such a frivolous guise. "She has nice feelings," thought Paul, who took himself tremendously in earnest. He brought her a chair. "My grandfather told me about seeing you yesterday." She reddened and exclaimed spiritedly, "It wasn't fair of him. It isn't fair to make people ashamed of things there isn't any wrong in." "Anyway, you have won his heart," Paul said apologetically. "Why, it was wonderful that he should speak of me," said the girl, her eyes wide with surprise. It seemed as if some great statue, with its head in the clouds, had spoken of her. "We have lived with grandfather and grandmother ever since our mother died." "Oh, how awful!" exclaimed Betty. "Awful to live with grandfather?" inquired the surprised Paul. "Oh, no, that is beautiful, but not to have a mother. Lois hasn't a mother either. I don't see how people live without them." We were too young to feel it, and our grandparents have been everything to us. Father's business compels him to travel a great deal. To Betty he was someone to be sorry for, just as Lois was. "What a smart little piece your friend is," said Reginald to Lois, looking towards Betty. "Piece?" repeated Lois in surprise. But looking into his merry blue eyes, she saw that in his boyish fashion he had expressed genuine admiration for her friend. "I never," he continued in his happy young voice, "saw a girl go through a thing the way she did that tonight. And Granddad said so too. And she's only 14. Why, I'm a year older than that, and I couldn't begin to do it. Did she ever do it before?" "No, this was her first time." "Gee whiz!" gasped the boy, and the two talked on, having a congenial subject. "You are going home to morrow, I suppose," said Reginald to Betty. "I am thankful to say I am," she answered. "You are coming back?" asked Paul in a peremptory manner. "If I must," she answered, wholly nettled at his air of disapprobation. "You, then, find school irksome and would like to escape?" pursued Paul in his earnest way, scolding, Betty thought it. "All the world round, if man bear to have it so, things which might vex him shall be found." She quoted her favorite defense wearily in answer, as the Bishop approached to make his adieus. The two girls were silent until they reached their room, when Betty burst into a flood of tears. She was overwrought from the strain of the play and the excitement following it. Half laughing, she made her defense. "I am only a little country girl after all. See how you bear it." "Yes, but I didn't have half to do that you had." "Your recitation was perfect. I was so proud of you." "With your triumph you can afford to be generous," said Lois. "That big boy didn't like it," answered Betty dejectedly. "His grandfather did, and his brother thinks you were wonderful." "Oh, he doesn't know anything. He's only 6 months older than I am. I asked him, and I don't care what he thought. But the Bishop's nice compliments did puff me up a little." End of chapter 11. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 12 of Betty Baird by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 12. At Home for Christmas. She was going home for Christmas. Oh, joy! On the train her heart sang in unison with the click of the wheels on the rails. Christmas had always been a wonderful event for her, but now it meant not only that, but going home after 4 months' absence to Father and Mother and Edith and Miss Jane and Elder Huggentugler and the others. Betty was met at the station by her father, behind whom stood Edith and all the girls of the old crowd. They were eager to see in what way she had changed, for they fully expected a great difference. When she got off the car, they saw her in the very same clothes she had worn when she went away. But oh, the hat was so new and stylish. Anyone could see that it came straight from New York. Her joy on seeing them proved that she had not grown proud. There was a settled belief among them that boarding schools make girls stuck up. Betty and her father walked on ahead, while the escort of honor, consisting of Edith, May, Ada, Jane, Martha, and Sally, followed close behind. She looked back every minute or two to say something to her followers, and in between times they discussed her. "She is taller," said Edith. "She is pretty. I didn't know she was pretty," said May. "Where in the world were your eyes?" asked the loyal Edith. "Her hat is becoming," contributed Ada. A few gay words from Betty, and the inventory would continue. "She's just as cute as ever," avouched Jane, after one of Betty's speeches over her shoulder. "I wonder if she has any new poetry," said Edith, and she ran on ahead to ask, coming back joyfully to announce that she had a great deal, and some new songs too. "She will sing and recite at our Christmas entertainment. And oh, girls, she was in a play." "Oh!" ejaculated the group in a long-drawn breath. When Mrs. Baird had Betty in her arms, she said to herself, "I can never, never let her go away again," and Betty felt that she could never leave. Old Kitty showed all her shining teeth as she welcomed her with a loving scolding. "Hurry up now, chile. Everything'll be dead cold if you don't git a move on you." There was her favorite jelly on the table, and holly leaves and berries added to the cheer. It was a royal homecoming. For 10 days her tongue hardly ceased. Every detail of her life at the Pines was rehearsed for the satisfaction and amazement of all willing listeners. Of course her mother was always there, and was a glad listener to things she had heard a dozen times, and each time with a glow of satisfaction or indignation or surprise, whatever the emotion the story demanded. But the slights on account of her clothes Betty told only to her mother. Her father stole downstairs from his study again and again to listen without comment to the school stories, his pale face flushing with pride when she related her Latin triumphs, triumphs she had not thought much about until she found how they pleased her parents. Betty never allowed anything to lose by the telling. She was truthful, yet she was, above all, graphic. She delighted in lively narrative, and she made the girls' hair stand on end as she described the midnight frolics. Miss Jane came to see her with eyes alight with pleasure, and snapped out, "Well, I carc'late you're more stuck up 'n ever." "Oh, Miss Jane," remonstrated Betty, with an assumed offended air, raising her hands protestingly. "I thought you would be so glad to see me, and you begin to scold the first thing." "I can't begin too soon," she replied, shaking her head sagely, while she rummaged through her bag for her knitting and spectacles. When she had adjusted her glasses and settled herself to her knitting, sitting up straight as a ramrod, she looked over her glasses complacently at Betty, who was talking to Edith and showing her photographs of the schoolgirls. "I guess, 'Lizbeth, there wasn't many better dressed girls 'n you at that high ton school o' yourn, was they?" "High? Nothing but the tower," answered Betty, who wanted to avoid reference to her clothes. She had not brought home her lilac silk, as she felt it would hurt Miss Jane to see the alterations made so soon. She could in fancy hear her criticism of certain rough inside seams, and the complacent comparison with her own neat finish. "Highty tighty," answered Miss Jane, and Mrs. Baird, knowing Betty's purpose, sent her out on an errand. "That child is changed, Mrs. Baird. 'Lizbeth's different. She is still a colt, but a tamed one." At the Christmas entertainment of the Sunday school, Betty recited and sang. Usually the program was a pretty slow affair, but this night it was given color and dash by her personality and her gifts in music and recitation. Her several numbers were received with great applause, particularly the last. A recitation, which accompanied by her vivid dramatic action, caused great excitement. So great, indeed, that Mr. Jones, solemn and red, short and rotund, approached her in an embarrassed manner, and extending his right arm as he swung off to one side, dropped into her outstretched hand 3 pink peppermints, while Elder Huggentugler turned around, and tilting back his chair and reaching back to her over the intervening shoulders, tossed into her lap a poke o' peanuts, with the words, "Betty, you done beautiful." The 10 days flew by all too swiftly, and Betty found herself once again at the Pines. Miss Greene welcomed her with evident satisfaction. "I was afraid they would keep you," she said. "Bishop Waborn has been asking about you. He says Reginald contends that you are the first girl he ever knew who was equal to a boy." "Hope not for mind in women," was her indifferent comment. "I think I shall have to spend this year in trying to break that habit of quoting, Elizabeth," said Miss Greene, semi-seriously. End of chapter 12. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 13 of Betty Baird by Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 13. A Feast, a Trial, a New Teacher. The monotony of school routine to which the roommates had become accustomed during the fall term now, after 10 free joyous days at home, returned to them with redoubled force. Something must be done to relieve it, so they decided to give a midnight feast, always a thrilling performance. There was a great deal of make-believe about these feasts. The girls tried hard to ignore what they fully recognized, that they were not so much a break for liberty as they seemed to be. Yet they were outlets for youthful spirits, perhaps a little too repressed in the regular life of the school, and a certain number were always expected during the year and considered by the teachers things to be winked at, since ordinarily they involved no infraction of any important rule of the school. So, 2 weeks after their return, Betty sent out cabalistic invitations, illuminated in red and gold after the fashion of an old missal in the library. At the sign of the moon, at the hour of the fairy ring dance. By the exercise of their wits they contrived to smuggle in what they fondly regarded to be abundant supplies for a fair banquet. After dinner they were congratulating themselves upon their success, when suddenly Betty threw up her hands, gave a groan, and dropped into a chair. Lois was frightened. "Oh, dear, Betty, what is the matter? Are you sick?" Betty's look of distress was almost dissipated by the laugh in her eyes. "Oh, Lois, it's all spoiled. Who ever heard of a feast at the Pines without Charlotte Russe? And here we've entirely forgotten it." Lois looked aghast, and she too dropped into a chair. "Oh, dear, oh, dear, oh, dear. It will not be worth keeping the girls up for," she said dolefully. "Yes, and I really boasted about it to Mary and Dorothy, right before Miriam, too. She, by the way, declined to come. I'm glad of it, too." "So am I," agreed Lois heartily. "But what are we to do, Lois? What are we to do? The girls are scattered all around on different floors, and oh, I know what I'll do." And Betty straightened up and clapped her hands gleefully. "Oh, what is it?" "You know that little shop kept by that nice old woman just outside the gate? She and I are great friends, and I can get them there. I'll dress up like an old woman and get out through the kitchen. Lizzie is there, and she'll do anything for us. I'll not be afraid, for the night watchman is on the grounds, and he'll think I'm one of the servants." "I'll go with you." "No, you mustn't. There is less risk with one." "I'll watch you from our window." "Well, you may do that, though there's really nothing to fear with old John out there, and I can talk loike any old Irish lady." Electrified by the scheme, Betty went merrily to work. She knotted her hair into an untidy roll, wisps straggling out here and there. On her head was an old untrimmed hat tied under her chin by a frayed ribbon. On her feet a forlorn pair of overshoes, a faded green shawl, and long bedraggled petticoat completing an effective disguise. With a small basket on her arm she sallied forth. She crept down through the servants' hall into the dining room, through which she expected to escape in safety to the kitchen. The dining room was dark, and she started to grope her way towards the kitchen door, a long distance to make without a board creaking. She had traversed perhaps half the distance when the dining room door was suddenly flung open and revealed Miss Leet peering into the room, the light from the hall shining directly on the kitchen door. Crouching behind one of the tables, Betty hoped Miss Leet would soon leave, but the latter, swinging the door back still farther, propped it open with a chair, then began to wander up and down the hall, leaving Betty greatly puzzled to know what to do next. She saw that she could not get out by the kitchen door, so finding herself near a window, she waited until Miss Leet was at the farther end of the hall, then opened it quietly, dropped her basket to the ground, and clambered after it. She was halfway down the walk and was breathing freely again when she suddenly came upon the old watchman, whose vigilant eyes she had hoped to escape. "Och, thin, where do yez be goin' this time o' night?" he inquired. "Yez wouldn't be afther interferin' with an old woman, would yez?" Betty answered in her richest brogue. "I disremember havin' seen yez afore. How long have yez been here?" "Oh, I'm just afther stayin' here a while with some old friends." Betty pushed him away as he chucked her under the chin. "Arrah, be off with your monkey tricks," she protested, as she ran off as fast as her old shoes and long dress would allow her, while she determined to elude him on her return trip. Having procured the things she needed, she trudged back to school. As old John was pacing his accustomed beat, Betty took another path, but she did not entirely escape his observation. "Looks like someone movin'," he muttered, and walked towards her. She hid behind a big tree just in time, the darkness under it aiding her. Believing that his eyes had deceived him, the watchman continued his round, turning frequently to assure himself that there was no loiterer within the sacred precincts. As soon as his back was turned, Betty darted out and reached another big tree, when John stopped and turned, listening attentively. She was breathless from excitement and fear of discovery, yet she enjoyed the chase. The old man walked in her direction, muttering to himself, until he was so close that he actually rested his hand on the tree behind which she was hiding. He peered in all directions, but did not think to look so near home for what he was seeking. Betty was in a shiver. This was certainly too close for fun. If he came around the tree her chances for escaping were small, but to her great relief she heard him mutter, "Must 'a' been the trees movin' I saw," and he walked toward the front of the house, while Betty made her way to the kitchen door. She hurried up the stairs, meeting no one, rushed into the room where Lois had been watching her strategic movements from the window, and threw herself on the bed to recuperate. At the fairies' hour, from 12 to 1, 8 fairies entered the room, one after the other, led by Mary Livingstone, who had on a bright blue kimono, strings of Christmas tree decorations and popcorn encircling her neck, and toy rings on her fingers. She made a dazzling picture in the candlelight. Dorothy was in black, with silver paper stars hung around her neck and sewed on her kimono. A great silver crescent moon in her hair completed the captivating costume emblematic of night. Lois wore a pink velveteen robe and a silver paper crown in her hair, giving her the air of a princess. As might be expected, Jess had a touch of the grotesque in her costume, which was a bright crimson kimono with a red peaked cap and other Mephistophelian touches. Helen and Caroline were 2 fairies with light unbraided hair, dressed alike in pink, and with pink artificial roses as girdles. Betty had brought from home for just such an occasion an old black brocade gown of her grandmother's. It had a short empire waist, half low neck and short sleeves, and a broad lace collar fastened by an old cameo pin. The hoops were small but sufficiently large to give the proper effect. Her yellow hair was piled on top of her head and surmounted by an old-fashioned tortoise-shell comb. At one end of the room hung an old red lantern, a recognized fixture of midnight feasts at the Pines. At the other end, on a small table, stood a huge stuffed black cat, their mascot. 2 pairs of tin candlesticks stood on the tablecloth which was spread on the floor. A great bowl of red roses formed the centerpiece, and 1 rose lay at each plate, their artificiality being not too glaring in the candlelight. The plates formed an odd collection, gathered from all sources. The butter was in its own special wooden tray, made resplendent by a gorgeous paper napkin decorated with wreaths of red roses. The sardines reposed in the native silver cans, the pickles in their own lovely Bohemian glass bottles. 2 large silver loving cups, in common parlance tin buckets, with red roses tied to their handles, furnished the drinking vessels, aided by an odd tumbler or 2. Tied to each rose at the plates was a place card bearing these words, with illuminated initials: "And now they throng the moonlit glade, Above, below, on every side, Their little minim forms arrayed In all the tricksy pomp of fairy pride." After a series of mystic incantations, insisted on by Betty as proper to such a great occasion, the feasters took their appointed places and "fell to," as Jess called it, with much subdued jollity. The time passed very quickly, and the town clock boomed out 1 o'clock long before they expected it. Accompanying it came the usual Chanticleer chorus, with the comment from Caroline, "I wonder why roosters always crow just at 1 o'clock." "Because they are natural chronometers," flashed Betty, which caused a ripple of laughter impossible to stifle. "Hush, girls! Old Leedy will hear us," cautioned one. "Yes, she will be only too glad of a chance to crow over us," agreed another. As the magic power leaves at 1 o'clock, the fairies flitted to their rooms, to be surprised on the way by an ogre, Miss Leet. "Miss Payne will hear of this tomorrow," she announced grimly. "How did she happen to come up here?" the girls asked one another, for Miss Barry and Miss Smith were the teachers on that floor, and that was the question that disturbed more than one girl's rest that night. The next morning Miss Payne called out the names of those who had been caught and told them to come to her room. Betty and Lois were not mentioned among them, as they had not been seen by Miss Leet, but nevertheless they went with the others. "I didn't ask for you two," said Miss Payne when she saw them. "Is it about last night, Miss Payne?" asked Betty, going right to the point. "It is," she answered shortly. "Lois and I came in, Miss Payne, because the feast was held in our room. I suppose that was why Miss Leet did not see us." Miss Leet had an intimation that there was to be this violation of the rules, but she did not know what room it was to be in," explained Miss Payne. The principal's estimate of the gravity of the affair was indicated by the lightness of the punishment inflicted, to memorize Gray's Elegy within the week. As they left the room 12 angrier girls could not be found. Even Caroline Wren was stirred to deep resentment, and her usually unchanging blonde face became crimson. The bored Dorothy was excited enough to gesticulate violently, and of course Helen was following suit. Lois was pale and weak from emotion, while Mary's brown eyes flashed and her lip curled scornfully. As for Betty, well, she was haranguing the group, her hair standing on end from running her fingers through it, her cheeks flushed angrily. It would not be hard to guess the cause of the turbulence. Certainly it was not the words of the preceptress, nor the easily memorized poem. The storm centered on the absent-minded words of Miss Payne. Miss Leet had an intimation that there was to be this violation of the rules. Who, questioned they, had been mean enough to tell her? Suspicion turned to Miriam. It came out that to harm Betty she had done many underhanded things, small in themselves, but telling largely against her at this crisis. "I saw her talking with Miss Leet only yesterday," said Helen. "I saw her too," chimed in Jess, "and they stopped until I got by, though I heard Bet's name, but I didn't dream it was any sneaking business like this." "Well," said Caroline, "I have always been Miriam's friend. I cease to be so from this day. I now see some things in a very different light. Something she said to me yesterday. Begging me not to go to the feast looks mightily suspicious. I thought it was just her jealousy of Betty." "It couldn't have been any one else," said Mary emphatically. "The question is, girls, what are we going to do about it?" demanded Betty. "She may be innocent. Let us ask her." "Ask her!" they exclaimed. "Why, a telltale will lie." "It means fair play," answered Betty. "We'll put her on trial. Who will bring her here?" she asked, as hazy memories of the trial of Warren Hastings, which she had loved to read, floated through her mind. "You be the judge, Betty," they demanded. "I am not sure I can be impartial," she protested. "Well, we'll be the jury and decide the question," said Lois. "Who is going for her?" asked Dorothy. "I'll go," volunteered Jess, and went out. In a few minutes she returned with Miriam, who seemed very sullen. Around the room sat 9 solemn girls, Judge Betty in a high-backed chair facing the door. "Did you tell Miss Leet about our feast last night?" she demanded abruptly. "What right have you to ask?" sneered Miriam. "We want to give you a chance to declare your innocence. We have good reasons for suspecting you. If you are innocent, say so, and then we will go about finding the guilty sneak." The last word was hardly worthy of a judge, but her indignation grew as she spoke. "I refuse to answer," said Miriam stubbornly. "You ask her, Dorothy. Perhaps she'll answer you." "I don't care to have her speak to me," said Dorothy scornfully, and walked out of the room. Miriam tossed her head. "Let's not say anything more about it," said Betty, and Miriam left the room. "For pity's sake, what made you shut up that way?" demanded Jess. "Oh, I thought she had enough after Dorothy said that. Then, too, I suddenly had a feeling that Leet wormed it out of her. I don't believe even Miriam would deliberately tell on her best friend just to spite me." Betty spoke in italics and made some impression in Miriam's favor. "Well," said Mary, "that may be as you say, but why didn't she warn us when she found out old Leetey knew about it? She evidently tried to warn Caroline." "Yes, she did," said Caroline reluctantly, evidently disliking her position as the best friend of the most unpopular girl in the school. "Well, I certainly don't like Miriam, but I despise that Miss Leet. She's a snake in the grass. I wish we could get her out of the school," said Betty. "How could we manage it?" asked Lois. "Tell Miss Payne about this Miriam affair. She hates underhanded methods," said Jess. "I don't like telling," said Betty. "We might all fail regularly in our history when she has the class. We can't do it in algebra because I fail anyhow. Perhaps she will understand and will be only too willing to leave the Pines." "Good scheme! I am not in your class, so I can't add to her sufferings," said Mary regretfully. "Most of us are, and we'll all say, 'I am unprepared,' day after day until she reports it to Miss Payne. Then, when she asks us about it, we'll tell her we can't recite to such a person," explained Betty. "I can't see the difference between that and going to Miss Payne at once," said the practical bell hunter. Betty looked at her pityingly. "We show Leet in the plainest way that we do not respect her, and force her to tell on herself by telling on us, for she will know the real reason, you may be sure." "Well, I can't see any great difference yet, but I am willing," said Belle. The next history class was exciting. Jess was called on first, and in a clear tone responded, "Not prepared." Miss Leet looked at her, saying, "Wait after class hour." Then she called on Lois, who also responded, "Not prepared." Miss Leet, showing some surprise, told her too to remain. Caroline also joined in the refrain, "Not prepared," and was greeted with, "I am not surprised, but you too may remain after class. Now, Miriam," she went on sweetly. As the latter recited, every girl looked coldly away. She had taken her accustomed seat next to Caroline, who steadily refused to notice her. Then came Dorothy, who was also unprepared. "She looks as if she smells a rat," whispered Jess to Betty, who in reply quoted softly and compassionately, as she looked at Miss Leet, "In all the endless road you tread, there's nothing but the night, and unprepared." "Elizabeth Baird," called Miss Leet sharply as the whisper fell on her ears. Betty turned her head slowly and looked at her with cool, imperturbable eyes. "What were you saying?" "Only a line of poetry." "Repeat it." "In all the endless road you tread, there's nothing but the night, and unprepared." "Leave the room," commanded the angry teacher, and after a few more unprepareds, she dismissed the class. This continued for a week, and Miss Leet, unable to stand the strain, told Miss Payne, giving as the probable reason for their conduct her report of the feast. She named Betty as the ringleader. The history class was called to Miss Payne's room. "Young ladies, I have been told by Miss Leet that since she faithfully reported your breaking of the rules, you have refused to recite in her history class. What is the explanation of this insubordination?" She looked severely at Betty, who trembled, but managed to answer in a firm voice, "We do not care to recite to Miss Leet." "I do not catch your meaning," and Miss Payne's voice showed amazement and displeasure. "It is this way, Miss Payne. Miss Leet has been going around listening at our doors. We know that because we caught her at it. No girl in the school would deliberately have told her about our feast, and we are sure she wormed it out of one of them. If we had been fairly caught by one of the teachers on that floor, we wouldn't have cared a bit. But to have Miss Leet go at it in such an underhanded way was more than we could stand, and we decided we would not recite any more history to her." Miss Payne studied the girls' faces thoughtfully for a while. Then she said, "I shall inquire into this and see you again if necessary. You are dismissed." Miss Leet secured another position and soon left the Pines, to the great rejoicing of the pupils. The next morning Betty said to Lois, "I am going to tell Miss Payne this morning about going out for those things the other night. I shouldn't have done that. You know we are strictly forbidden to go outside of the gate without permission. I don't know why I didn't think of it that way before, but I suppose it was this excitement about Miss Leet. I wonder what Miss Payne will do to me. Oh, dear, I hope she won't send me away from school. What would Mother think?" "Send you away from school for a little thing like that?" "It wasn't a little thing, Lois. The feast itself wasn't so bad, but to dress up like that and go outside of the gate was, and you know it. I am going down right now and tell her and have it off my mind." "I am going with you." "What for?" asked Betty in surprise. "Because I was in it as much as you were. The only reason I didn't go with you is because you wouldn't let me." "Well, you are not going now." "I am, and you can't keep me from it this time," and she went. Miss Payne heard the story, contritely told, and looked very grave indeed. "I am exceedingly sorry to hear this, Elizabeth. You know how strict our rule is about going outside the grounds. And to think of your going out that way at night! I fear I shall have to punish you severely. I must ask you not to go out with the other pupils on Saturday afternoons for the rest of the term. And you," she added, turning to Lois, "must not go out for a month." And with some kind words she dismissed the two humbled girls. The teacher who took Miss Leet's place was Miss Spice. To the roommates her name was suggestive of pleasant home cheer. A wholesome, practical, intellectual woman, of sterling character, with the saving graces of humor and sympathy. The pupils at once dubbed her Spice Cake. A few days after her arrival, Miss Greene invited her to her room, and over a friendly cup of tea they fell to discussing the pupils whom Miss Spice was eager to understand in order to do effective work. Betty, always interesting to Miss Greene, occupied a large part of their conversation. "You will find her decidedly deficient in mathematics. Miss Leet's antagonism increased her natural distaste. We are all anxious to have her improve, for it is the only branch in which she is behind her class. If you can win her regard, she will work hard to please you, for she is a conscientious student as well as a devoted friend," Miss Greene explained. "Her bright face attracted me," replied Miss Spice, "and I wondered at her failure in the class. I shall be doubly interested in her now. I judge she is a born leader." "She seems to care very little for managing people or affairs, but she is fond of the picturesque and poetic. Her chief power lies in doing things in a way different from the humdrum, and the girls like it. Then, too, she enters heart and soul into everything she undertakes and inspires others. There is no gray in her color scheme. She deals in the primaries." "I shall enjoy seeing what I can do for her," said Miss Spice enthusiastically. Then the conversation drifted to other topics. In algebra, Miss Spice found Betty attentive but puzzled. Her talk with Miss Greene had shown her the trouble, and she soon settled on a remedy. Having won Betty's confidence, she drilled her thoroughly, not only in class, but often during the study hour in her own room, reviewing the lessons with her from the beginning. Betty worked hard, devoting every spare moment to the detested study, with the result that she passed an examination with credit to both teacher and pupil. The last week of the school year, Betty and Lois spent together in the shadowy old park, where, arm in arm, they loitered through the shady paths, reading and dreaming and loving the great, beautiful summer world. To the young girls this was an enchanted place, and ever, as they walked there, they carried with them the little red and gold morocco volume, which expressed the things they loved most to talk about. The Idylls of the King spoke to them of castles and tournaments, of bold knights and glorious chivalry, while the very atmosphere seemed to hold the promise of something impending. For hours they wandered in the quaint old garden, tucked away in a corner of the great park, where the weather-beaten sundial, in the midst of the boxwood and old-time flowers, greeted them with the gracious assurance which symphonized well with their own feelings. I chronicle only the sunny hours. Tears ran down the cheeks of the girls as they read the parting words of the stricken Arthur to his few faithful retainers. The sequel of today unsolders all, the goodliest fellowship of famous knights, whereof this world holds record. Such a sleep they sleep, the men I loved. I think that we shall never more, at any future time, delight our souls with talk of knightly deeds, walking about the gardens and the halls of Camelot, as in the days that were. I can't bear it. It's so sad and sweet, said Lois, as the silent tears fell unheeded. This seems like Camelot, said Betty dreamily, after a long silence. It was a barren stretch of land. On the one side was the ocean, and on the other a great water, and the moon was full. So earnest were they that they missed the humor of comparing this beautiful park with that barren strip of sand. It was in those balmy days, as the friends walked through the dim paths, that the dream came to Betty of founding a knightly order for good and gentle deeds. With shining eyes she spoke to Lois of the growing impulse. "Oh, we must revive the spirit of chivalry, Lois. It is too beautiful to pass away forever. I, for one, believe in knighthood." End of chapter 13. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 14 of Betty Baird by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 14. Miss Jane's Seed Picter. Lois and Betty had grown more and more intimate as the months passed, and to their delight Mr. Baird had acceded to Mrs. Baird's urgent invitation to have Lois spend part of her vacation at Weston. So their parting was not such a sad matter as it might otherwise have proved, and Betty reached home on a bright June evening, warm and dirty, but joyous in the anticipation of a long, happy summer. "It's so good to be at home, Mother," she kept repeating. Her father was pleased with her glowing accounts of the school. "It is indeed gratifying, Elizabeth, to hear from our cousin that you received the highest marks in your class," he remarked. "She seems to think you were a prodigy in Latin. I trust, though, that this commendation will not conduce to any unworthy pride." "No, indeed," laughed Betty, "for she said it was not at all surprising when you were my teacher." Dr. Baird looked gratified and smiled complacently. "How did you manage to come up so in algebra?" asked her mother. "Oh, as I wrote you, that horrid Miss Leet left. We simply made her go. The dearest little teacher came in her place. She is the kind that makes stupid girls learn in spite of themselves, and I suppose that accounts for my progress. But really, I was ashamed to go into her classes unprepared, I liked her so much." "It seems like a miracle," said her mother, not without a motherly disdain of any hint of stupidity in her offspring. On Betty's first evening home, Elder Huggentugler came in. He was the oldest officer in the church, a thin, stooped little man with shrewd black eyes and a megaphone voice. He was very loyal to his pastor. A stick in the mud, he called himself, proud of his old-fashionedness. He seemed to have a lurking idea that his conservatism kept this old world from flying off at a tangent. Warming to reminiscences, he said to Betty, "I was an elder in this church before your daddy here was born. Yes, I was." And he shook his head argumentatively. "You have seen a great many changes, Elder," said Mrs. Baird. "Changes, Mum! Aye, that I have. They were a dumb lot here when I came over from Yeller Crick. I teached 'em everything. I was elder, sexton, Sabbath school superintendent, and I read from the Holy Book when floods kept the preacher away." "Didn't they have a regular pastor in those days, Elder?" asked Betty. "Bless you, no, child. We had to be satisfied with preachin' once a month, as the preacher had 7 or 8 churches to minister to. He had to ride from one to the other on horseback, and when the water was high he often couldn't ford the streams. Then we had to go without any preachin'. Many's the night I've stayed up to daybreak, keepin' floatin' trees and logs from breakin' down my cabin, leanin' out of an upstairs window and pushin' them away with a long pole." "How exciting!" exclaimed Betty. "Excitin'? My child, there is nothin' as stealthy and tetchy as a crick, except," and his fist came down with an emphatic blow on the table, "except church music committees." Dr. and Mrs. Baird exchanged amused glances, for they knew what to expect. "Would you believe it, Betty?" he continued. "'Twas long before you was born they brought an organ into the church right under my nose." And again his knotted hand thumped the table. He looked around for sympathy, fully believing they all thought as he did, for he blamed only the music committee for introducing that devil's music, as he called it. "Well," he continued more calmly, "I got even with them. Before that cussed thing was brought into the sanctuary, I was always the first there for the meetin'. I seen after many things. Now I don't darken the door until that screech owl stops." And the old man chuckled. Early the next morning the Elder rapped loudly at the back door with his cane, calling Betty. She came running out to meet him, her fair hair and pretty white dress flying in the breeze. "Why, good morning, Elder," she cried delightedly, and the old man's heart warmed anew to her, for he had long been alone. "Morning, Betty," he answered cheerfully. "I fetched a poke o' posies for your garden. Last night on my way home I was thinkin' you'd be uneasy after bein' so busy gettin' book larnin', and thinks I, flowers is companions to women folks, and you have a goodly space here for 'em," waving his hand over the garden. He had taken off his old soft hat, uncovering his thick white hair, neatly parted far down on the right side. He was very clean and sweet looking in spite of his old coat. Though he had money in the bank, as his poor neighbors said, he rarely bought new clothes. The child, in her freshness and beauty, and the gentle old man formed a charming picture in Mrs. Baird's eyes, as she watched them go together into the old-fashioned garden and stand by the ancient well sweep. He was telling Betty his old grievance. "They even wanted to take this away once. Yes, and all them little panes of glass in the windows there. They carc'lated to take 'em out and put in big blazin' things, all one piece. Why, they was impudent lookin', good enough for them Robinsons down there," and he flipped his thumb disdainfully in the direction of the benighted neighbors. "Dancin' and card playin' folks, but not for a preacher of the everlastin' gospel." "I am glad you didn't let them do it, Elder. It would have been an awful shame to take away that old well sweep. And one of my teachers tells me those little panes of glass are all the fashion now for certain kinds of houses. We have them at our school." "You don't say so!" ejaculated the old man. Well, what's the world comin' to? But I believe I did hear them old mahogany cheers and tables is all the style." "Yes, indeed, Elder. People pay awfully high prices for chairs like my grandmother's." "That I should live to see the day. Why, Betty, they wanted your mother to sell that mahogany sideboard and get a little teeterin' yeller thing. Says I, 'Don't you do it, Mrs. Baird. It's been good for more'n 100 years and it's good enough now.' Yes, I did." Betty not only enjoyed taking care of the flowers in the garden, but she extended her activities to the house, where she tried to follow out the ideas she had gathered from Miss Greene, whose chief recreation was the study of artistic home decoration. The manse parlor, which the church committee, in a burst of artistic enthusiasm, had furnished the year before, especially demanded all her newly acquired knowledge. The fact that the room had 4 sunny windows had not affected the plans of that final court of appeals in matters of taste and appropriateness. Yellow was fashionable that year, and the room was therefore furnished in as many varieties of that color as the committee could find space for. The walls were covered with paper having large gold figures on a white ground. The floor was protected by a carpet presenting a lemon ground, over which trailed a design of small red roses. The furniture was upholstered in brilliant orange brocade satin. The windows had buff shades. On a sunny day the effect was sulphurous, but the pride of the committee in the result of its work diminished not a jot or a tittle. Betty asked her mother's permission to cover the glaring satin with pretty figured cretonne, a white ground with a design of tiny green leaves rioting over it, and to put up some soft curtains that greatly subdued the glare. They then went over the room carefully, selecting the pictures that would give the most restful feeling, and putting on the mantelpiece a squat green vase and a pair of silver candlesticks. After their labors were finished, they sat in the parlor congratulating themselves on its appearance, for the first time since the church showered its golden blessings on it. "There isn't an objectionable thing in the room now. Such a piece of luck that those wax flowers Mrs. Davis gave us happened to fall and break into smithereens," exulted Betty. "Yes, for I should have had to leave them in," answered her mother. "We can't afford to hurt people's kind feelings, no matter how much they hurt our artistic ones." "They were too much for me, the garish, ghostly things. But do look there, mother. Miss Jane and the Elder are coming in with a package, an immense one. What do you suppose it is?" And Betty hurried to the door. Miss Jane brushed flusteredly by her, bidding the Elder to bring the large square bundle into the house. With a bare nod, she unwrapped the package with eager fingers and displayed a remarkable object. From a background of common pasteboard stood out in strong black letters of some curious material the words, "There is no place like home." Above, below, to the right, to the left, were various designs. Gates ajar, wreaths, scrolls, broken hearts, crosses, and crowns, each in a different color, and surrounding all a heavy wreath of dismal black. This wonderful creation, of a material as yet unknown to Betty and her mother, was enclosed in a heavy dead black frame, broad and deep, the whole perhaps 1.25 yards square. "There, sir!" exclaimed Miss Jane triumphantly. "Even if you was to boardin' school a whole year, you never saw the beat of that!" And she beamed on Betty, snapping her long fingers at the mournful object. "What is it, Miss Jane?" asked Mrs. Baird. "There! I knowed it. It's a seed picter. Everything there is seeds. Apple seeds, orange seeds, lemon seeds, sunflower seeds, watermelon seeds, cowcumber seeds, all kinds of seeds is there." And she looked at Betty for some sign of her characteristic enthusiasm. "It's wonderful," sighed the latter, over whom was creeping the blighting fear that it was for her. "Wonderful!" said Miss Jane testily. "There ain't nothin' like it to the Pines, I carc'late." "No, there isn't," agreed Betty in an almost inaudible voice. Miss Jane, mistaking the cause of her emotion, looked immensely pleased. "It's for you, 'Lizbeth," she announced. "Oh, Miss Jane!" cried the girl, tears suffusing her eyes, tears that were the result of horror at the object and heartache at Miss Jane's goodness. Miss Jane was touched. "I knowed you was just sot on purty things, so I tried to think of somethin' real nice, not a dumb present like oh, you know. So I made this here picter. No one but me knows how, so there ain't another in the state. You'd have to go fur to find one." "That's right, you certainly would," agreed the Elder. Betty, laughing and crying, threw her arms around Miss Jane and laid her head on her shoulder. "Oh, Miss Jane, how could you spend all that time for me?" Miss Jane had a momentary shamefacedness. Then she brightened as she looked around and saw the furniture had been covered. "You deserves it for coverin' all them fine satin cheers. So savin' for you, 'Liz'beth." "Oh, as to that," began Betty, but her mother interrupted, drawing Miss Jane's attention to the picture. "Why did you take all your precious time making it for that child? It's the kindest thing I ever knew." "Well, I thought she'd miss all them purty things at the Pines, so I jest made that. Once a gal knows, she's apt to grow dissatisfied." Miss Jane looked around for a suitable place for the seed picture, and decided that the gilt mirror should come down from above the white mantelpiece to make room for it. There it remained, to the constant pride and joy of Miss Jane and the Elder. Betty did not feel, as Miss Jane intimated, that virtue had received its own proper reward. Sadly, she took the mirror out of the room and put it over the sitting room mantel, determined to make that room the object of her artistic efforts in the future. End of Chapter 14. Recording by Holly Jensen.